Hey everyone, welcome to Crank It Up Podcast, the YouTube home of Brigand Games. I'm Jim Price, designer of Erudia Battle of Birthrights, and today I want to talk about the Treasury through an unexpected lens. The other day, our team member Kritham raised an interesting question. Would I consider swapping out one of the Treasury cards for a community content card and moving whatever was removed to Brutality? And it's something I had considered before because of the Lamia Lyre, the Anachrony Treasury card. I haven't said much about the Lyre other than the fact that a lot of classes like it for completely different reasons, and at one point I was tempted to swap it out for one of the others. To entertain that idea, I would need to pick one to remove, which inadvertently led to the creation of the Lamia Lyre test, a way of measuring the effectiveness of Treasury cards. Normally, the approach is to consider what a card might bring if it were included. This is essentially the opposite. What would you lose by the removal of the card? Could you accept the removal? And can it withstand the arrival of a new card? This is a different vantage point because it relies on being objective and empirical, and I thought I would repeat that concept today, regardless of what the Lyre actually does. In some respects, this is a retrospective on the Treasury cards to learn and apply for future card designs from the community, as well as sharing some of the insight and lessons I've learned. For ease, I'll go through each one in order, talking about whether or not they would be able to pass the Lamia Lyre test. Aegis Shield is one of the few cards that largely exist as a counter to a game plan. In the core set, everyone has access to damage, with a number of classes having access to unavoidable damage which can bypass shields. But not this one. To lose the Aegis Shield would be a buff to fighters, cavalry, and wizards, but more importantly, Aegis Shield can be measured by the number of tactics it provides, which is essentially 3. My favorite usage of the Aegis Shield is that it saves the unit that a rival thinks they are close to killing, to the point where they might give up. It's a card that wins the tactic suppression war, and I would hate to lose that because it makes the timing of damage matter immensely. So I don't see myself dropping the shield, even though the shield is a natural fit in Brutality for many different reasons. Next is the Ashes, which came into existence as a way to deal with cloaking and became a chance to reset a key unit. But more importantly, it gives access to damage to all classes, so it must stay for that simple reason. The Azuran Idol is interesting because with many great attack-based acolytes, it saw a lot of use as a way of getting a leader when your acolyte has done its job. But I think it's the bottom fate that carries it long term because you essentially have a choice of 8 units. It's like drafting a chance at anyone and allowing you to defer that decision, and it's super interesting when that situation aligns. Given that acolytes are at the heart of the game and acolytes gain relevancy here, the idol must stay as well. The Bavarian Glaive is a flat 3 power, which is the baseline for weapons without some form of condition or constraint, but it's the flexibility of play that really makes it shine for me. There are a number of classes that cannot add advanced power, which the Glaive specifically addresses with its tactic flexibility. However, I also think that it shows the importance of morale, because knocking me down to 1 morale to prevent the Glaive has cost me many games, and I think making morale work and showing the consequences of its loss is more important to the health of the system than the flexibility of its play. Not having burst power could easily be explained as a weakness of classes, but as a Treasury card that may or may not be taken, it means morale loss is potentially relevant every game, and that would be a big loss. So this one comes close, and even though there are enough morale abilities in the core set to cover the gap, I'd rather accentuate the system than defer it to later. Next is the Blade of Erudia, which is a non-starter, not cutting it, so moving on. The Cloak of Karen is an interesting candidate because if it had appeared at a different time, it would be an amazing way of reintroducing cloaking. But I also think that it is a way of showing how thieves can use cloaking, how it is truly an avoidance of power creep, and it uses cloaking in a non-gimmicky way. Thieves, on occasion, can stay cloaked for just a few seconds to enable some of their boosts, but the cloak is specifically designed for long-term cloaking, making the mechanic feel very different. Just as the Ashes give access to damage, the cloak gives access to cloaking, or rather what cloaking can give you, because cloaking itself isn't the endgame, but the protection and the power creep is, and that's important because access is starting to become a sub-theme of the Treasury. I also like the dichotomy of whether or not a unit wants the shield or the cloak, as it shows the contrast of unit archetypes, so the cloak has to stay. The Dowsing Rod is the first candidate where I start to think, maybe this is the one. I think the Dowsing Rod is incredibly useful, and in a recent game it was actually an MVP. But I think it sleeps under the radar because it is largely booster-centric. That's because most primaries don't have items, and their secondary forms don't tend to have the same level of item impact for their special items. Some certainly do, but not to the same extent of grabbing the Fallachian Egg, or the Ancestral Core, or any fairy item, since Pixie Dust are just as important. I'm a bit torn because it is nice having an item that specifically calls to boosters, because they are an important part of the system, but do you forsake 8 primaries in the name of 4 boosters? It's a tough call. I think that the dowsing rod really shines for ambush or retreat items since you have the potential to use them in the same turn without telegraphing. The dowsing rod was also the royal item that underwent the most scrutiny to ensure the value it got, so at its halfway point, the dowsing rod looks suspect but also basic. Continuing the theme of basic is the Isidos, but the Isidos has an interesting debate itself. Many view the Isidos as a source of power, but really it's a source of units. For power, I prefer the guarantee of the glaive, as the Isidos can backfire or not give you as much as you want, but it can spread out. You can play the Isidos for the upside play or a risky play. When unit quantity matters, like clerics or Hivions, it matters a lot. So I had to learn to stop thinking about the Isidos in terms of power, but in terms of unit quantity, and that is an important trait. Since it becomes another Axis item, I'd label this one under prefer not to remove. To remove the memento is to ask me to remove my most drafted item, which isn't happening, but like many others, the memento is an Axis item, access to recursion. For this one, it's fair to ask, is recursion really necessary in a 50-card deck, when you yourself, Bandit, have stated a design principle of more bullets, less reloads? Yes, that's certainly true, but there should still be some reloads, and by doing this early, it means that recursion is built into potentially every deck, which means I don't have to put it in as many primaries, and lets me flesh those out further. So this would be a tremendous loss, and not just because the memento subtly hints at many of the game's secrets. I've said before that the Shard of Gaia is why the Treasury exists, and to remove this would force the inclusion of modifier destruction a lot more, which isn't happening. The Shard is a crucial part of the core set, and is going to get plenty of love in Anachrony and Brutality. For the Sylvan Boots, I sometimes remind myself of the odd reality that the Cavalry were not originally in the core set, and one of the movement boosters was, but even then, I'd still have wanted the boots because of access to movement. The health boost is interesting because it helps play the boots in advance, which is part of their value proposition, but I think that the boots have tremendous threat potential. You may think I don't have movement, but I do, and that is a reality that must always be considered, and that type of mind game is what you want in the game from the beginning. Movement is so useful that even the most movement primary still takes it often, despite having plenty of movement internally, because this has the potential to add more power to a closing battlefield than any other Treasury card currently. That just leaves the Tiers, the other card the Treasury was created for, and I think that the Tiers is a crucial necessity because it highlights what the Treasury does. It keeps your rival guessing and makes you consider how safe a battlefield really is. For the Tiers, its flat 2 power will always be a deprecation candidate, as there are stronger ambush cards in the system, but the unknown factor is what drives this card. When I lose to a Tiers play, it hurts, and has ramifications for future games. While the Tiers could certainly arrive later, as reusable synergies will be seen again, and sooner than you think, I'd hate to lose that post-game implication. When battlefields are won deterministically, it's a completely different feeling from the thrill of the risk, as it cements that leads aren't always safe, and I love the fact that the Tiers plays a role in games in which it isn't even drafted. In looking at the original 12, 2 major sub-themes occur. What is interesting on an Axis level providing new access to classes, and what makes for meaningful interaction with your rival. In a love it or lose it system, what items would lose ground to a newcomer like the Lyre, or whatever Brutality brings? The dowsing rod seems to be the closest to failing this test, unless you view it as access to access. Yet it's simple, and some cards should be simple, because there really isn't a wrong time to take the rod. In a 50-card deck, it doubles the chances of seeing a rare item, unless you potentially double use another. So should the rod stay or go? That's a really tough call, but by applying the Lamia Lyre test, it helps me realize the trends that make Treasury cards valuable, and that should matter to all of you as you look to design them in the future. But if you were me, and you had to cut one, what would it be? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, let's shut it down.